Stanford University.
Oh my gosh. So, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm in this classroom a lot, but never before such a group, or rarely before such a group, including one of my former teaching fellows when I was a student here at Stanford, not too many years ago. I tell my children, it might seem like a long time, but it's really not. Diane Warren was a teaching fellow for a psychology class that I was in. So that was a great experience, and I have family and friends here, old friends and new friends, so it's a pleasure to be here. I can't overstate that. Let me jump right into it, I guess. And I don't want to talk too much because I know you all have probably heard a lot of people talking. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit, for a law professor at least. And then, which my wife reminds me, the law professors can spend 30 minutes clearing their throats. But I won't do that. I'll drink water if I need to. And then I'll just talk for a little bit and then we'll have discussion because I really want to hear your input and reactions. So I had this book that just came out, which I carry with me as it turns out because somebody might ask me about it and I need to check it because make sure what's in that thing. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's the first thing I've written. I joined the faculty in 1998, written a lot of law review articles, most of which attracted readership of 50 people, 100 people, very important people. But this is the first thing I've written that's achieved some sort of broad attention and that has really struck a chord with people, something that people care about. And I've been struck by how intensely people do care about the issues that are raised in this book. And I know people care about them because they've called me lots of names, which is one way to find out whether you get people's attention. I've been called a racial pimp, profiteer, a pawn of white people, someone who's promoting self-genocide, someone who's an advocate for group annihilation of African Americans. One woman called a KQED show here with Michael Krasny and was outraged that a white person would write something that focused on black people in this way. And Michael Krasny said, well, I'm sorry, ma'am. I just want to let you know I'm in the studio with him. And let me just tell you, right? And she, was apologetic after that. So the book has attracted a lot of attention, which is, I try to take that in stride. But I am glad that it actually does speak to issues that are important to people, that they feel passionately about. And a lot of the strong reaction starts with the title. The title of this book is Marriage for White People, which is, I should note, a title that my research assistant chose, by way of disclosure, who's not here today. She's a law school graduate, a great lawyer, who I will be writing a recommendation for later today. But she chose this title because she said the titles that I had in mind were so boring they could put you to sleep. I had titles in mind like Race, Marriage, and Inequality, an exploration of a changing institution, or cultural effects and economic influences, why marriage has changed. She said all those were boring. Why not go with something provocative? So we did. And this provocative title comes from a young child, actually, a sixth grader in Washington, D.C., responded to a classroom visitor by saying, let me back up. There was a journalist who was visiting a class in Washington, D.C., and she was talking to the class about careers, and then the conversation turned to raising children. One of the kids said, hey, we want to learn about how to be fathers. And she said, great, I'll bring in some married couples to talk to you about how to be fathers or how to be parents. And the kid said, no, we don't want to hear about married couples. And then we just want to know about being parents. And then the other kid said, yeah, marriage is for white people. And that struck the journalist as it strikes the reader in reading about this account, because it was a stark expression of this young child's perception that marriage had declined so much in inner city Washington, D.C., that it just wasn't something that black people did. It was something that white people did. And they didn't have a sense that that was a possibility even for African Americans. So we took that title and we made it a question. And the question is marriage for white people but not for black people? But then it's also a question of, well, is marriage for anyone? Right, so is marriage for even white people? Because one of the central points in the book is that marriage has declined, especially for African Americans. But it's declined, in fact, throughout society. There are more unmarried people now, or a higher percentage of unmarried people now than ever in our history. Right, and that's for a lot of reasons. But marriage is changing. Right, and so marriage has declined throughout society, but especially for African Americans. And the title is meant to capture both of those in a way that is attention-getting. And it has received some attention. Most of the controversy much of the controversy revolves around the idea of interracial relationships, which I talk about in the book. And in short, the position in the book, which I thought was a uncontroversial one, frankly, or not as controversial as it has seemed, is that it would be a good thing or that interracial marriage can be a good thing. And interracial relationships are positive things, not something that we should shun or stigmatize or discourage, but in fact something that we should welcome, especially in the case of African American women. And that's the claim that has generated the response of genocide and annihilation, and the constant questions, frankly. The most popular question I'll get, which is one we don't need to ask, is whether I'm black. The second question is whether my wife is black. And those are the questions that come up all the time. And even a journalist recently from USA Today, this is an article that'll appear next week, she sent me an email because we had a telephone interview. And I think she read the book, but she said, I just wanted to know, what's your racial designation? And I emailed her back. I said, well, you can say African American. And obviously that's sort of relevant to her story in a way. And so, so the controversies focus on this interracial idea. But the book is really much more than that. And when I began writing it, I conceived of it as much more than that. I started thinking about this more than a decade ago, actually even farther back, but I really started working on it a decade ago. I teach family law, among other courses. And in family law, the central issue is the changing American family. And there are lots of books written about the changing American family and about the decline in marriage and related developments. And most of them talk about American society generally, but they don't focus on African Americans. Right? So these are books about American society, and African Americans are kind of a footnote, or 2 pages at the end of a chapter. And there are other books written about African Americans in marriage, but those books focus entirely on poor people. Right? So those are books about the poor in the inner city of Chicago who are left without jobs, and the women have children without being married. And that's an important issue, and there are a lot of books and articles written about that. But there was actually nothing, literally nothing, written about middle-class African Americans. Right? People like myself, or like people who go to Stanford or other universities. Even though that's a large and growing group, there was nothing written about marriage among middle-class African Americans. So what I wanted to do in this book was to try to focus on the experiences of middle-class African Americans, because I had a sense that marriage had declined among that group as well. And as I got more into that story, I realized that there was a connection between what was happening among middle-class African Americans and the rest of American society. So then I began to explicitly frame the book around the idea that the issues that African Americans confront and what we see happening with African Americans is, in fact, a more pronounced or acute version of what we see happening throughout society. Right? So there's a particular story about African Americans, but that particular story actually sheds light on a more universal story, because the same trends that are operating throughout society are intensified with respect to African Americans. Right? And there are many, many examples of this, and the one that's perhaps is the most salient is with respect to unwed childbearing. Right? So in 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a famous report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, called the Moynihan, came to be known as the Moynihan Report, which many of you may have studied at some point. And he famously declared the single-parent Negro family a tangle of pathology, right? And he said the Negro family, as he put it, the Negro family was crumbling, and the sign of the Negro family crumbling was that so many black women had children without being married. And at that time, slightly less than 25% of black children were born to unmarried parents. Now that number is substantially above 25% for white women, right? More than 25% of white children are born to unmarried parents. And if we look at young white women who have children in their 20s, in fact, and this is one of these statistics that I had to check time and again, young white women who have their first child in their 20s, 60% of those women are not married when they have their child. I know, I had to check that. 60% of them, and this is actually research according to sociologists at the University of Texas, I should add, Mark Rigneris, who's written a number of books in this area. 60% of white women who have children in their early 20s are not married. And a lot of that is a socioeconomic effect, that the women who have children when they're 22 are much less educated than the women who have their first child when they're 32, right? And so there's a story there. But among African Americans, of course, the percentage of children who are born to unmarried parents is higher still. Right now it's above 70%, or about 70% for African Americans. So the numbers have moved in the same directions for both groups, with whites now being about where African Americans were 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. And we see the same sort of relationship if we look at women in the workforce, if we look at the percentage of wives who earn more than their husbands, and most recently, if we look at the position of men economically. Right, the position of white men economically, not a surprise, perhaps, is becoming more similar in this current recession, certainly, to the position that black men have occupied over the past few decades, which is increasingly marginalized economically, losing ground to women as women now exceed men and surpass men in college enrollment. Especially true for African Americans, but true for others. So there are a lot of ways in which there are connections between these two. Between the particular story of African Americans and the universal story in our society. So when I started, one more note about how I started. So when I started writing the book, wanting to sort of flesh out some of these connections, it was a purely academic book. I was seeing it as closer to some of the law review articles that I wrote, where you have this much text and this many footnotes, right? Because you have to document everything, right? And that's what I do, right? That's what law professors do. So I thought of it in that way. And I spent years on and off kind of combing through different areas of research, starting with law, but then extending to psychology and sociology and history and economics and areas that might even seem unrelated to family patterns, right? Because part of the goal in the book was to actually draw a connection between things like the global market for labor and technological advances and marriage patterns, right? So I want to see what happens within relationships, but the whole idea here was to try to explain the broad cultural, economic, technological shifts. So it really is a question of how has advancing technology changed people's relationships, right? How has the movement of jobs overseas changed people's relationships? How did the birth control pill change people's relationships, right? These are all the big influences that I wanted to try to figure out what effect they were having, how did they interact. So I looked at a lot of research to do that. And one day, and this is why I'm so thankful to be here at Stanford talking about this, because I could not have done this without Stanford, I'll say. And not only the law school and the dean, Larry Kramer, and my colleagues here, but without lots of Stanford alums who sparked this project in really crucial ways. And one of those alums was a woman who shall remain anonymous, who I was talking to one day about this project, which was purely an academic project at that point, purely something based on research, right? Because law professors don't usually go out and talk to people. We just go in our offices and we talk to our colleagues, and I mean, really, that's it, right? But I was talking to her, and this is someone who is, she thinks she's a young graduate of Stanford. Current students think she's a really old person who graduated from Stanford. I was talking to her, and she was really interested in the book and really thought, wow, tell me more. And then before we just kept going on. And then she began to share some of her own experience because she was unmarried, is the mother of a child. She's African American, Stanford alum. And she began to share some of her own experience And then, for hours had passed, right? And she basically said, see, this book seems like it would relate to my life and my experiences in a way that no other book has. And it was also apparent that because she felt that way, she wanted to share her own story. So we decided to conduct an interview where I would talk to her about her life, and she would reflect on her life. And then I realized this interview thing might be good because it was really rich, what she had to say. And what she had to say even highlighted for me issues that I had not thought clearly about. Because she was able, some of her experiences, which she didn't realize, that some of her experiences alerted me to patterns in some of the data, so to speak, that I would otherwise have overlooked. So then I began to interview another person and another person, and I sort of formally decided to interview lots of people. And the interviews shaped the book. They shaped the project. So then I began to think of it less as a purely academic project that was based on research in books and in the library, and more on research in a broader sense. Research that was library research, but also research that involved talking to people for hours and hours and hours about their lives. And that research was transformative for me. To think of it that way. I think of it as a kind of combining a bottom-up and a top-down approach. The top-down is kind of the books and the library and the studies and all of that, and the bottom-up is the stories of people's lives. And you bring those together in a way that each can inform the other, right? So I see things in the data that I would not have imagined were it not for the interviews, and then the data kind of allows me to think about what sort of issues I might want to raise for the interviews. And so that was a magical experience. And I started off thinking that I would interview people of all races and ages and so forth. But then it became clear that the issues had a particular salience for African Americans because it is African Americans among whom marriage has declined the most. And that sort of was the core of the book. And then I thought, well, okay, I'll interview lots of African Americans of all ages and men and women. But then I kind of changed that over time because I interviewed, frankly, a number of young people, that is, people who were just out of college, say, or even in college. And I realized, frankly, that they hadn't lived too much. And they just, talking to someone who's 22 or 20 or 24 even about marriage and relationships is a whole different conversation than talking to someone who's 40. Because when you're 40, not that I would know, right? But when you're 40, you look ahead, but you also reflect back, right? And so you're both thinking about your life where you are now, but then you're also assessing where you've been. And you start to think, well, why did I turn left rather than right? What would have happened had I done this? And you think about all the sorts of things that you can't think about when you're in the experience, but then you can reflect back and begin to assess. So the interviews I said, well, maybe I should talk more to women than men. Talk more to older people than younger people. And then I was still thinking of talking to a lot of men, but then I also noticed that there was a difference between talking to men and women. So when you talk about marriage and children and family, men will answer your questions, and sometimes they are eager to talk, but typically their answers are short. They're like, if you ask a yes or no question, you will get a yes or no answer, right? Whereas with women, when you ask, well, do you envision having children? It could be yes or no, right? But it's not, it goes on and on, right? And the women will talk, and it's just, this might sound like a stereotype, but the women will just talk, right? And I had a couple of situations where I felt this very acutely, where I had interviews set up kind of back to back, and talking to the men, it was just very short and brief, and they'd respond. Whereas the women would often begin an answer with, I was just talking to my girlfriend about that. And then it goes on, this long conversation. Right? So then I realized that a lot of these issues related to marriage, family, having children, they resonated with women in a deeper way, frankly, than they did with men. Right? And part of this is because of the sense of timing. Right? If you talk to a 33-year-old woman about having children versus a 33-year-old man about having children, they might have a different set of concerns there. And so then I began to focus more on women. So we have African-American women in their 30s and their 40s. Unsurprisingly, a lot of these women are graduates of Stanford, just because I know some of those people. A lot of them are graduates of Harvard, where I went to law school. A lot of them are friends of those people or friends of those people. And everyone's anonymous, and details have been changed, so nobody can be identified. But so that's how the book came together. So the research on the one hand and then lots of interviews on the other. And there were three sort of centers of gravity in this project that I focused on. One is the marriage decline, right? So across society, people were less likely to be married now than in, say, 1950. Big decline there. It's especially precipitous among African Americans. About 70% of black women are unmarried. Even college-educated black women are about twice as likely to be unmarried as college-educated white women. So there's a big racial gap there that applies with men as well. Black men are less likely to be married than white men at every income level. Even black men who earn, say, $100,000 a year, I think are about twice as likely. Some of these are rough because I'm not checking my text here. Some black men who earn about $100,000 a year, who earn $100,000 a year, are about twice as likely as their white counterparts to be unmarried. So there's a racial gap in marriage across the socioeconomic spectrum. We see it among men, we see it among women, and that's what results in that 70% of black children being born to unmarried parents, right, is that racial gap in marriage. And I should note that this racial gap in marriage is not simply a gap in formal marriage, right? So it's not the case that you have large numbers of people who are, living together and unmarried in a long period of time, right? It really is an issue of a lack of stable, enduring, committed relationships. Sort of a lack of partnership is what we see in the marriage decline here. And I can talk about how this compares to what's happening in other countries, and I talk about that in the book, but just keep in mind that the marriage, when I say marriage decline, that's really a shorthand for the decline of stable, committed, monogamous relationships. And we see that throughout society, but especially among African Americans. So a pivotal factor in this marriage decline is that women have moved ahead, which is a good thing, but men have fallen behind. And this as a parent of three boys. This is this is a very difficult book to write. I'll just say it was a difficult book to write. It's a difficult book to write because, when you write about the Supreme Court's definition of racial discrimination in these particular cases and how that changed, or, whether someone should have standing, you can't only get so worked up about that, right? But and this book started out as a more purely legal book, I should add too, that was really focused on family policy. But then the personal issues got to be so interesting that I decided to zero in on those. But the personal issues are also issues that hit very close to home for all of us, because we all live in families. Many of us have been or are or want to be married and either do or might have children. So all of these issues hit close to home. And one of the issues that hits close to home for me is the fact that while black women have done well in many respects, black men have struggled in a way that is very distressing. Twice as many black women as black men graduate from college every year. Twice as many. It's actually, for those sticklers out there, it's actually 1.95 to 1, okay? But we're gonna round that up to 2, right? 1.95 to 1, right? So about twice as many black women as men graduate from college. And that is a striking statistic. It is the case as well that among the population in general, more women than men graduate from college now. Right? So again, we see this development throughout society, but especially pronounced among African Americans, where we have 2 to 1 in college. Black women even dominate black men in traditionally male fields such as computer science. In engineering, there are more black women who are majoring in computer science or engineering right now and who will receive degrees this year than there are black men by far. Black women are approaching 2 to 1 nationwide in law school and medical school. So we have these huge gaps. And then at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, 1 in 10 black men, more than 1 in 10 black men, in fact, is in prison or jail as we speak. These are men in their 20s to early 30s. This is like prime marriaging age. And 1 in 10, actually about 1 in 9, but we'll just say 1 in 10 are in jail or prison. 1 in 4 are estimated to spend time in jail or prison. right? So the backdrop for relationships now among African Americans is a world where there are twice as many black women as men graduating from college, and 10% or more of the men are just out of circulation, right? And then there's another large percentage that may not be in jail, but their lives are not looking real promising, right? So the question then is, well, what happens when we create that skewed gender ratio? And one way to understand what happens is when we create that ratio is to think about the relationships as a market. And this is the framework I've used really throughout the book. Right? This is a book that's not very romantic, right? So if you want someone who's going to explain, how you can visualize your reality and bring it about simply by envisioning it, which one of my sisters says, if you envision what you want, it'll happen. This is not a book that goes into all that, right? This is a book that just says, look, here are the facts, here's the information. The fact is we have this many men, this many women, people are out there in the relationship market, and what happens in that relationship market is going to be influenced a lot by the numbers of men and women. And so one thing that happens in that relationship market is that higher achieving women are more likely than they've ever been to marry lower achieving men, right? So more than half of college educated black wives have a less educated husband. That's another striking statistic, right? So you can think of college educated women, about 50% of them are married to a guy who didn't graduate from college. This is among African Americans. 50% of black women are married to a guy who didn't graduate from college. But it's also true that among whites, women are about 4, 5, 6 times as likely as they were 30 or 40 years ago to earn more than their husbands. Right? 30 or 40 years ago, in 1970, I think, say there were only 2 or 3% of wives who earned more than their husbands. Now it's 25%. So it's about 1/4. So again, trends in the same direction, but more extreme among African Americans and among other groups. So that's one development. The other development, so black women lead in a sense. They're at the front end of the decline in marriage and the front end of the marrying less educated or lower earning men. But they trail in another development, and that's with respect to interracial marriage. And this is the puzzle that really pulled me throughout the book to try to figure this out. Black women have the smallest group of men within their race to marry. Black women have the smallest group of men within their race to marry, right? Because of incarceration, educational underachievement, economic failures on the part of black men. Yet they're also the least likely to marry someone of another race. Right? Only about 10%, actually less than 10% of black women, even looking at recent marriages, will marry someone of a different race. Whereas for black men, it's between 2 and 3 times as much as that. So black men are between 2 and 3 times as likely to marry someone of another race as black women. Asian Americans and Latinos are also more than 3 times as likely as black women to marry outside their race. So black women simply are, in terms of their intimate lives, the most segregated group in the nation. And you might even think that black women are especially likely to marry lower earning men and especially likely to be unmarried because they don't marry across group lines. This is where all the trouble starts here, right? And then the question is, my question was really, why is that? And would it be a good thing if more black women married across group lines? And I'll just say here, there are a bunch of different reasons for why black women are so segregated in their intimate lives. I think of it really like a puzzle with different pieces. There are a lot of different pieces to the puzzle, right? One piece to the puzzle is that black women are disinclined to marry across group lines because we, as a society, have made so many of them feel that if they did so, they would be abandoning black men, betraying the race, leaving brothers behind, however you want to put it, right? There's a sense that what a good black woman would do is to hang in there with the black man, even as, or especially because the black men have struggled so much. And that somehow it's the black woman's role to help him and lift him and pull him along, right? What would be worse, according to this view, than to go to a place like Stanford and become successful and have a job as a banker or a lawyer or something, and then, abandon your group. Right? That's the message that we've given black women in all sorts of ways. And that results in many feeling that they don't have the option to marry across group lines. And the story of the book is basically one thread of the story is that, well, actually, no, black women have more options than they think, more options than we've led them to believe that they think. And that actually it would be a good thing if more black women were to do the same thing that other groups of people have done and to expand their options in terms of their relationships. And if they expanded their options in terms of their relationships, we would have more black women marrying men of other races, and that would be positive. In fact, I argue that those women would, in many cases, have better relationships with non-black men who have a similar socioeconomic status than they would with black men who have a different socioeconomic status. In other words, those women would actually be better matched with the person they sat next to in law school, say, who might be Asian American or Latino or white or Middle Eastern. They'd have a better relationship with that guy than the black guy they grew up with, but who, for whatever reason, did not go to college. So that's one argument. And again, I say this is not my opinion, I'm the messenger. I'm the messenger. I'm the one who distills the information. So, whenever I make a claim and someone says, well, how do you know that? Why do you say that? Well, my answer would be, well, there's research on that, right? And there usually is, and there actually is research on this even, that black women who marry men of other races actually do have lower divorce rates, frankly. This is another surprising thing. They have lower divorce rates, according to the best available research, than black women who marry black men. I just put that out there. Black women who marry men of other races have lower divorce rates than black women who marry black men, and part of the reason for that, I think, is because a lot of the black women who marry black men are married to guys who they're not well matched with. And part of the reason they're not well matched is because they have a whole different set of experiences, aspirations, sensibilities, education levels, professional trajectories, all of that stuff. So that's one statement that's got me into a lot of trouble. The other statement that gets me into a lot of trouble is that, in fact, if black women are concerned about African American marriages, the best thing that they could do to bolster marriage among African Americans would actually be to open their options to men of other races. Right? So there's the paradox there that by considering interracial relationships, they actually bolster relationships within the race. Right? And the reason that is because part of the problem when you have the skewed gender ratio is that the group that's in short supply has a lot of power. So because black men are scarce, frankly, black men have a lot more power than black women do in relationships because black men have a lot more options than black women do, right? So lots of women means lots of options for men, few men means few options for women. And that shapes the relationship. And this is not only true among African Americans, this is true generally, right? We have researchers who've looked at gender ratios on college campuses because, again, women are the majority in college now. And when you look at college campuses, you find that there are campuses that vary dramatically in their gender ratios, right? Some are 50-50 or even 55-45 men, and others are 65-35 women. And some researchers have looked at that and concluded that the gender ratio on campus has a pretty strong influence on the type of relationships that people have on those campuses. So when men are in short supply, say when they're 35% of the population and women are 65%, that means men have more power because they have more options. And if they have more power, they can dictate the type of relationships that occur. And so what sort of relationships do we think men might want versus what women might want? And it just turns out that the men in the relationship, in the campuses where the men are in short supply, researchers have found that there tend to be fewer boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, fewer long-term monogamous relationships, so on and so right there. I was surprised by this, right? But that's a finding that some people think is really sensible, that men and women might have different ideas about the type of relationship they want, and so that men use their power to have relationships that are to their liking, whereas women would use their power to have different types of relationships that are to their liking. So that's what happens on college campuses. We also see evidence that sex ratios matter when we look at China, say. Right? So China is a flip side of what we see on college campuses, right? Because there are a lot of men and few women as a result of one-child policy. But it's also the case that gender ratios vary across Chinese provinces. And so researchers have looked and said, well, let's see how varying gender ratios influences people's behavior. And what they find there is that in areas where there are even more men than average relative to the number of women, the men work harder, they save more money, they buy bigger houses, they do all these things that you can only interpret as something that would give them an advantage in the search for a wife. When the competition is stiffer, they step up their game, right? Because they know, right, that the competition is stiffer. Again, so this is in China, right, the opposite side, right? So we see this, and this is a very difficult thing to study because there are always so many variables that might influence, obviously, people's behavior. But it seems sensible that the sex ratio might influence the behavior of men and women. And so with African Americans, we see that African American men, even the highest earning men, are much less likely than their white counterparts to be married. And there's some evidence even that the highest earning black men who earn more than $100,000 a year, are even less likely to be married than men who earn, say, $50,000 a year or $60,000 a year. So there's a big gap in marriage, and there's even a drop-off in marriage for the highest earning African Americans. And part of the story there would be that African American men, like men of any group, might become disinclined to marry when they don't have to. When they're more able to dictate the terms of the relationship, they're more apt to choose non-marital relationships. That is, they're less inclined to embrace ongoing, long-term, monogamous, committed relationship. And that's part of the African American marriage decline as well. So now that's part of the African American marriage decline. If this power disparity between black men and women is the problem, then it might seem that the best thing black women could do is to increase their own power in their relationships. And the only way they can increase their own power vis-a-vis black men is to expand their options and open themselves to relationships with other men. So if they do that, it's kind of, to be blunt, it kind of means, well, if you're in a relationship with a guy, you're a woman, and this gets me in trouble too. If you're in a relationship with a guy and he knows and you know that you don't have a lot of options outside of that relationship, he's actually not going to treat you as well as he might if he knew that you could leave. Because there are other things you could do, right? And if you had better options, then he has the incentive to treat you better. And if he has the incentive to treat you better, it might also mean that the black woman would more be in a position to, as a friend says, be the deal maker in the relationship rather than simply the deal taker. To actually be able to get the relationship that she wants rather than settle for the relationship that the man wants. So in that way, for black women, there's this paradox that although we might think of interracial marriage as abandoning the race or betraying the race or leaving black men behind, it actually is a good thing, not only for the women and for their children, who are going to be more likely to grow up with two parents. It's a good thing for the black community more generally and for African American couples as well. Because in the long run, right, even the black men are going to benefit from marriage. It's just that they might have a shorter run perspective in their own decision making. So that's sort of where the book ends up. And along the way, I sort of explore all of these issues through, again, this combination of research on one hand, with personal stories on the other. And I'm always hesitant to say anything about the books. I guess I can just quote reviewers, though. My favorite review was and then I'll open it up for questions. My favorite review was in a publication called The Daily. I don't know if people have read that, which I had never heard of it, but it was a wonderfully written review. It's a publication for the iPad. And the reviewer started off by saying that this book, the title of this book is provocative in the worst kind of way. But then he said, but the book is provocative in the best kind of way. And then he went on to talk about that. And I was like, yeah, I like that. And the other So that was, and the other good thing that happened this week, this has been an especially good week. I'm in a light mood now. This has been an especially good week because we also had an article in my favorite magazine, The Economist, who wrote a really, really nice article. I didn't write it myself, although it might seem that way if you read it, but it was a really nice piece, so I was really happy with that. And our goal now is to try to move from these very short snippets of coverage that we've had thus far, which is 3 minutes on CNN and another 2 minutes on CNN and 4 minutes on this show, and that's just the way television works, even a lot of radio. Now we're going to try to move to some longer form coverage. So we're going to have half an hour or an hour on some television outlets and on some other radio shows. So let's open it up for questions. Or I can read sections too if people like, but I'm happy to take questions.
This has no relevancy other than the fact this might be a very good forum for me. When I matriculated here 59 years ago, for your race we used the term Negro. Well, that's no longer common use now. So I'm going to ask, is the preferred reference to your race African American or is it black?
I prefer anything other than boy. I take it all. I take it all, right? Take it all. Other than boy. Really? Yes. Next.
I understand on one hand, the theory of this book was that it brought about the collapse of the black family with policies of the Free Society.
Yep.
Number one, is that accurate?
Yep.
Number two, if it is accurate, do you agree with it? Why?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I talk about that in the book, which is always my first insight. I should talk about it in the book, and I do. And so there are a lot of people who looked at, there's two big categories of causes that people focused on. One is Great Society, poverty programs, and then other people have looked at slavery in Africa. Moynihan also talked a lot about slavery and the influence of slavery. And both of those may be parts of the puzzle, right? But they're not the primary component, right? Because welfare programs might plausibly explain that, and the idea here is that welfare programs either give women incentives to be unmarried, make it possible for them to live without a man, or they preclude them from living with a man, right? And so that may be part of the puzzle, but that certainly can explain why marriage has declined even among middle-class African Americans, right? Not only middle-class women, but middle-class men as well. Right, so that's an explanation that's focused on the poor. It may explain part of the story among the poor, but it certainly can't explain the story among the non-poor. And that's what is really the focus of my book, is the non-poor. Similarly, when people talk about slavery, say, which Moynihan talked about a lot as well, slavery might be part of the story, right? Slavery is a big deal. But it's also the case that in 1950, marriage rates were pretty similar across racial groups. There wasn't a big divide. There were some differences, but there wasn't a big divide across races in terms of marriage rates. But there was something that happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s that led to this marriage decline. And only through really strained reasoning could you imagine that slavery, accounts for what happened in 1960, 70, and 80. So those are both part of the puzzle, but they're not the whole story. To understand why marriage has changed, I think we need to look at cultural and economic influences that affected the entire society through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Yes?
First I want to say I did hear you on KQED, and that woman chewed you out.
Mm-hmm.
I knew ahead of time you were black, so I didn't know what her problem was.
Oh. Well.
But as far as the title of the book, I first heard a teenager 10 years ago say that marriage was for white people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
It made absolute sense that that was the reality they were living on.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that I have, and I haven't read your book, although I can give you.
Yeah, we got books right outside, and they tell me that if they don't sell them, I have to buy them, and I don't want to buy those. So I don't want to buy those.
The problem I had, and I'm sure maybe you addressed it in the book, was that I felt like you were giving a pass to America because you don't address the number of African American males who are dead. And I
Mm-hmm.
heard at one point that for women who are of marital age, not just 20 or 30,
Mm-hmm.
but that's like 22%
Mm-hmm.
of all those men are dead. No doubt.
Well,
Did your research show that, or was that just something that was just on the internet and totally
I think that was on the internet and totally bogus. But the broader issue, no, the broader issue there is that we do have census figures, and sometimes you'll hear stories about, there are X numbers, X more women than men in the population and so forth. And the census, the problem with the census, right? There are a lot of people missing from the census calculations, right? And the people who are missing because they don't have regular places to live, because they're marginal, basically, in all these sort of ways, right? They're not working at a regular job with a regular place to live, so they're not counted. And those men are, unfortunately, disproportionately African, or they're disproportionately men, and especially African-American men, which is a measure of the men's marginalization. So it's actually hard to tell, get actually really accurate raw numbers, frankly, on the numbers of men and women. And when we look at murders, in fact, murder is a horrible thing, right? And it's horrible. We want murder rates to be lower rather than high. But even when murder rates are high, and African American men do lead in murders, we have tens of thousands of murders in the entire nation every year, right? And tens of thousands of murders in a nation of 300 million people, even if 50%, as is the case, of those murders are of African Americans, and they're typically men, that's not making a big dent in the overall population, right? And then we can add to that, though, accidents and other stuff, right? Other forms of death. So there is some disparity that results from murder and accidents, but the big factors, I'll just say the big factors that shape the sex ratio, I give three. One big factor is incarceration, right? And incarceration is bound up with all these other forms of marginality because unsurprisingly, or maybe surprisingly, but sadly, black boys who do not graduate from college are likely to end up in prison. As many as 2 out of 3, I think it's 60 or 65%, I have this in the book, 2 out of 3 black boys who don't graduate from high school go to jail. Nationwide, right? 2 out of 3. So that's to say that the incarceration boom is a result of criminal justice policy, but it's also a result of educational failures that are failures of the nation, right? Which result in so many people not graduating from high school and so many African Americans not graduating from high school. And then it's also a result of the fact that even those who do graduate from high school, if they don't go to college, they don't have a job, right? So there's incarceration, and then there's economic marginality that results from the lack of jobs for less educated people, which is especially African American men, but now increasingly white men as well. And this is about how the economy has changed and the labor market has changed, because a lot of the jobs that people in my family, my cousin is here, our family had in Cleveland, working at steel mills and auto plants and all these sort of jobs, those jobs don't exist now. So men who would have been able to support a family in 1970 or 60 or 50 with a high school diploma or less, they just can't do it. So it's unsurprising that a lot of those men end up in the drug trade or some other illegal activity, and then they end up in prison. So incarceration is a cause of the problem, but it's also a symptom of these other, I would say, actually deeper problems. And then the third factor for black women is that, again, black men intermarry 2 to 3 times as frequently as black women. So when you take all these men away, you have a pool where you have black women who are looking within the race, and there are just not enough guys there who are able to be the sorts of husbands that they want. Yes? Yep.
65, 35, etc. Sounds like what you're saying is that men are just making a bet about what relationship path will give them the most opportunity, frankly, to reproduce.
You're saying that.
If
Yeah.
you're 35, you're not engaging in relationships, monogamous relationships
Yep.
as much as you said.
Yep.
And it seems
Yep.
that because
Yep.
you give
Yep.
more opportunities to produce.
Yep.
So
Yep.
the question is, do men and women have different goals for marriage? And the second question is, do those goals change when you think about it across racial and gender lines, so black men, white men?
Yep. Yeah, so some people, I'll try to be real quick because I want to get some more questions. Some people have suggested that women, if you talk to women who are in their 20s, say that they're more interested in marriage than men are. I don't know that that's true. But some people have suggested that. And I think it probably is, there is a different strategy there. Ultimately, I think men, I think most people ultimately do want a partner. And that's obviously a big issue in the book. Most people do want a partner ultimately, right? You don't imagine thinking, I want to raise children alone or grow old alone. But men and women often have different timelines in mind in wanting that partner, right? For reasons that we can readily come to mind. So that leads to different behaviors. And across race, if I'm tracking your question right, across race, I think that, one of the goals of the book is to try to rebut claims that we see differences between African Americans and others due to some specific African American culture. My overarching, throughout the book, I sort of point out where claims that cultural differences account for racial differences are usually wrong. Usually, those supposedly cultural differences can actually be explained on the basis of different situations or different circumstances. So if black women make different decisions than white women, or if poor women make different decisions than affluent women or black men than white men, it's usually because their circumstances differ and that other groups would make the same sort of decisions if they were in the same circumstances. So that's the overarching point. Yes, in the back. Anyway. Well, I have, I don't know. We could throw it out open, right? But I will say, let me give you one question. There was one study which I mentioned in the book, which there's one study I mentioned in the book by OkCupid, which got a lot of press, and they used this study to say that white men don't want to date black women, right? And in fact, when you look at that, you find that even if, and there are some white men who don't want to date black women, but basically men actually are more open to interracial relationships than women are. And that's true across the board. That's true for every group, right? That women tend to be more focused on, having everybody fit well together and work well together and having good relationships within the family. They're a little more risk averse, and that is reflected in wanting a partner of the same group. And that can be race or religion or some other group. So men have lower boundaries in that way than women. They have fewer filters than women. And in this OkCupid study, and so there are a lot of white men who actually are very open to black women. And that's a number, one thing that's surprising is that number of white men, say, who are interested in black women is almost certainly greater than the number of black women out in the population, right? Because black women are a small part of the population, white men are a larger part of the population. I talk about this a lot in the book and the various studies that we have on this. It's also the case that in this OkCupid study, for example, they said that white men were less likely than black men weren't as likely as they should have been to respond to black women. But it was also the case in that study that they looked at Latinos, they looked at Asian Americans, they looked at Indian Americans, they looked at Middle Easterners, and those groups were actually more likely to respond to black women than white men, and some of those groups were more likely to respond to black women than black men. Right? Let me just say it again. They were more likely to respond to black women on the internet than black men were, right? So there's a lot of possibility out there, and the big puzzle, it really is a puzzle of, we have the most educated, accomplished group of black women in our nation now, more than ever, right? More than ever. Black women are educated and accomplished, so how is it that black women uniquely are segregated in this marriage realm when all other groups are increasingly entering an integrated relationship market, right? And I talk about why that is, but we should get it out of our mind that it's inevitable and it's because there are no options, right? There are a variety of explanations for that phenomenon. Okay, yes? Yeah. If you would like to say so, okay? But you're a Stanford grad, though. Oh, next question over here. Next question. Who do we want? It just came out. It's the first time we've done this.
In the last calendar year in Berkeley, and in Piedmont and parts of a huge upsurge of women in interracial.
Yep.
It's been so
Black women, interracial couples.
black women
Yep.
interracial.
Yep.
And it has been so
Yep.
startling
Yep.
in its increase.
Yep.
I was wondering,
I think that's right. And there's some ways. I'll just say one.
you noticed
Yep. Well, yep. Well, let me give you part of it. So California leads the nation. Well, part of the reason that happened in the last 12 months is because people heard about my book, so they began talking about it. But it is true that California leads the nation, right? I mean, this is unsurprising, right? This is a very racially diverse area, so we have more interracial companies of all sorts. And one of the factors there, I'll just say, one of the factors there is that when people move away from home, they become more likely to engage in what researchers would call non-normative relationships, right? Relationships that their parents might not approve of. And those might be relationships with someone of a different race, or they might be relationships with someone of the same sex. But when people move away from home and you get away from your family and your friends and your community, all their love and affection, which can also be social control, becomes less effective, right? And so then people can make decisions that are their decisions. So the moral there is that one of the reasons that interracial relationships have, been low, right, and for black women especially, has to do with a whole set of pressures that originate with family and friends and community to have people make relationships that they want them to make rather than the relationships that the individuals might want. So it's not surprising that in California, where people move away, you see much higher rates of interracial relationships, much higher rates of same-sex relationships. You also see, for example, that if you look at black women who immigrate from another country, they're much more likely to marry across racial lines than black women who are born in the United States and stay where they grew up, right? And that's true more generally, that immigrants generally are much more likely to form interracial relationships, right? So, explore all those in much more detail. So we have time for one more question? Okay, one more question. And then, for those who actually are interested, we'll show afterward, I have a short video clip with my favorite ABC News correspondent, Lindsay Davis from Nightline, which we just did, which just showed a couple days ago. So I'll show that. Then that's just 5 minutes. I'll show that after we break, though, and people can watch it. And then we'll sell books and sign books and all that stuff. Okay. So this side, is there a question over here? I want to come to. Yes, sir.
You haven't spoken about implications of children in these
Yep.
single-parent family situations, whether they're white or black.
I do. I talk about that in the book. Yeah, and that's not a. This is well, the best circumstance for children is to be raised by both their parents. That's the best circumstance for children. They're more likely to be raised by both their parents when their parents are married. And it's not that there's a magic to marriage, but it is the case that in our society, the relationships that are the most committed and likely to be the most enduring are marital relationships. So when we see that 70% of black children are born to unmarried parents, some of those parents are living together when the children are born, but the overwhelming majority of those relationships dissolve within a year or two, right? So what that means, that 70% figure, that means, and I mean, I don't want to end on a high point, but I mean, that means that, the majority of black children are not raised by their parents living together. So they don't have all the benefits, the child development benefits, the economic benefits, all the benefits that two people can provide. They don't have those benefits because when the parents are not together, the relationship with one or the other, usually this relationship with the father, tends to wane for a variety of reasons across time. So this is not a good development for children. It's not a good development for African American children in particular. For those of you who came from the education forum, one of the issues that there is a huge divide in terms of all sorts of outcomes between children who are raised by two parents and children who are raised by one parent. There's also a socioeconomic divide in our society, which is widening, and that socioeconomic divide actually tracks the marriage divide. So the children who are born to less educated, lower earning parents are extraordinarily likely to be raised by one parent alone. Children who are born to more affluent parents, better educated parents are more likely now, in fact, much more likely than those lower earning parents and even more likely than 30 years ago to be raised by both parents. So there's a way in which you have the socioeconomic divide. That socioeconomic divide tracks the marriage divide. People are marrying people within their socioeconomic group. So we have highly educated, affluent people who are, in a sense, consolidating gains, providing good outcomes for their children, and less educated parents are not doing that for a whole host of reasons, right? But that's not happening among less educated, less affluent parents, and those children are suffering horribly. But within this story, even the African American middle class is an outlier among the middle class. Because even among middle class African Americans, the African American middle class is the outlier among the middle class, because even among educated and affluent African Americans, we see a lot of the same issues that we see among much less advantaged whites. So, so that's sort of the sad part of the story, which animates the whole book, right, and which has motivated the book, is how to understand what's happening. So thank you all. And
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.